Thank you. Very good morning to all of you. And I was thinking of starting with some jokes, but we've had one, and unfortunately we don't have too much time, so I'll skip the jokes, get straight to the message. So, just following on the talk you just heard, it's pretty obvious that last year was not great. I think most forecasters would suggest that this year is going to be somewhat better. I think there's some reason for that belief, and I'll walk you through some of that. But in general, I think the sense is there is not much room for stimulus, whether it comes from the government through fiscal policy or from central banks through more monetary easing. They've pretty much done what they could. They will not admit they can't do much more, but really most of the bullets they have are shot. So what can we hope? Well, I think what we can hope is that at the very least we get good policy that avoids bad outcomes. Policy is very important today. It's very important to make sure that we avoid bad outcomes. We can get bad policy, and that would be disastrous in these times. So we need good policy. The obvious bad outcomes, we still have some possibility of a worsening euro crisis. I don't think we're out of the woods. I'll talk about why I think that is so. We're better than we were last year, and last year we were better than the way we were in 2011, but I think we still need more action, more good action. Of course, the US has avoided the fiscal cliff only to create a set of mini cliffs, what one might call the fiscal rapids. And they have to navigate that over the next few months. That's going to be difficult, and again, things could get more problematic. And of course, even while this is going on, I think a more fundamental change is going on in China. China is, like some of these other areas, trying to fundamentally change its process of growth, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's something that gets overlooked, and I think China is going to be very important in these times to come. In terms of what I believe, I think I believe quite strongly that Europe can and probably will be stabilized, but I don't think the resolution, the full resolution, will be done in a few months. This is something that is going to take years. And over this period, I don't think the political will go too far ahead. They will not, or we will not get a full-blown solution. We will get partial solutions which move the process forward, but which don't move far beyond what the political constraints will be, and that means that we will get fairly slow growth with periodic negative shocks. And I'll talk about why I think the political structure will only allow for that. I think US growth will pick up over time. It will get stronger. The US will become, again, one of the big engines of world growth. In the short run, however, there are fiscal drags in place which are going to keep the pace of growth somewhat more moderated. But also I would argue that when you look at growth in the European continent or in the United States, you have to remember that the historical rates of growth before the Great Recession, were unsustainable. They were growth fueled with a high octane dose of debt. That debt is no longer available. Therefore, growth in general is going to be slower. We have to rediscover new ways of growth, both in Europe and in the United States, and that again is going to take time. In the meanwhile, the Chinese have, I think, managed to slow down the economy to a pace they're comfortable with, and it's now picking up, as yesterday's export numbers suggest, as also the import numbers. I think China's attempting a big change, both on the economic front and down the line, willy-nilly, it will have to do something on the political front. Those two big changes I want to talk a little bit about as we go through. In this, the new leadership is extremely important, but relatively unknown. So we don't know which way they're going to turn. And one of the big geopolitical centers of doubt today is Asia. Let me talk about that a little more. I mean, we all know the geopolitical hotspots, the Straits of Hormuz. Things have quietened down a little bit, and the recent move by the Obama administration to appoint Chuck Hagel as the defense secretary suggests that they are backing off from a totally one-sided support of Israel to a more nuanced stance, which would then give the Israeli government a little pause if in fact it intended to attack Iranian facilities. The signal sent by the Chuck Hagel appointment suggests the temperature in the Straits of Hormuz may come down somewhat. However, I think you cannot completely rule out the possibility of action there. And as you know, 14 to 15 million barrels of oil go through those straits every day. So even if there is a small possibility of disruption, it could be calamitous for the world market. And there is a risk premium still somewhat still built into oil prices as a result. But I think an equally, perhaps more important source of geopolitical concern is China's relationships with its neighbors. As you know, recently Japan elected a ultra-nationalist government which aims to redress some of the age-old grievances that Japan has. And this comes at a time when the Chinese themselves are very sensitive to territorial issues, and there have been frictions between China and its neighbors. How these develop over time, between China and Japan, between Japan and Korea, between Vietnam and China, between India and China, lots of frictions in the Asian region. Given that this is the fastest growing region in the world, it matters for the rest of the world what happens here, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. Of course, in the short run, there are still concerns. And these concerns are, to some extent, building political pressures that haven't actually come out full force. For example, we've had 5 years of very slow growth in Greece and Spain, high levels of unemployment. At what point does this boil out into the streets in a much bigger way? It hasn't happened in a big way so far. Yes, there have been street protests that have been televised across the world from Greece, but it hasn't become more virulent, more harmful, more damaging. And that is something that could happen at some point. Years of slow growth eventually build up into pressure that spills over. And how long more can this continue? When are we going to see growth? Now, good news is, at this point, you hope the fiscal drags in Europe are slowing down, and Europe has a chance to come back into growth. We saw some evidence of increasing competitiveness, lower unit labor costs in the periphery. That should also help, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in general, we need growth. If we don't get growth in the periphery, if we don't get lower unemployment, I think we have a serious risk of political disruption. In the United States, this is demonstrated in the anti-1% movement. You saw President Obama's recent tax hikes on the rich. This is part of an ongoing process in which there's a lot of concern expressed about the fact that the gains from growth have been largely apportioned by the wealthy, and as a result, we should tax more. I will argue that some higher taxation is probably okay, but at this time, we also need growth in the world. And growth in an advanced industrial country comes not from putting more people to work necessarily or putting more capital to work, but by creating new ideas, creating ways of doing things better, faster, in a less costly way. This kind of growth requires entrepreneurship, requires invention, innovation, and that requires incentives. So you don't get that kind of growth through 75% tax rates on the rich. And that tension has to play against the fact that we have got growing levels of inequality, certainly in the United States. How do you balance the need for innovation and growth and incentives for the professional class versus the fact that many of the people have not got the benefits of growth and want more taxation? That's another big issue that is going to be facing us in the years to come. And of course, with governments with heavy amounts of debt, we're already seeing the beginnings of some kinds of financial protectionism. Financial protectionism meaning you, my financial institutions in my country, have to buy more assets within the country, don't invest abroad, buy more government bonds, because that is going to make it easier for us to finance our deficits. One of the things you see during the crisis is the fraction of government bonds held by your banks is directly proportional to how risky the government bonds are. Riskier the government bonds, more the banks hold of the government bonds. Now, there are various explanations of this, but one of them is the government gently telling its banks, look, you better invest in my bonds, otherwise there's nobody else to buy them. If you don't, see what I do. So there are veiled hints. The highest level of government bond holdings, of course, are in Greece, in the banks, but you see a straight line. Spain, substantial holdings of government bonds, and only the safest countries have lower holdings of their own government bonds. So more risky the country, the more its bonds are held by its own banks. So these are short-term concerns, I think concerns that play out over a year or two. There are also medium-term concerns, 5 years out. What happens 5 years and beyond? I think two big issues. I think the central theme that I believe is that the big problem in industrial countries was growth slowed down in the 70s and the 80s. It was too slow. And in order to pump up that growth, countries spent more via the government. You see the government public debt on the right-hand side here, which has gone up steadily since the mid-70s. But they also spent more through other forms of credit, household credit expanding or bank credit expanding. Now, however, we find that we've reached the limits of that debt. You can't borrow anymore. And at the same time, those promises are outstanding, as well as the earlier promises that were made on social security, on healthcare. So a number of countries, including the United States, find that when they aggregate across all promises, and public debt is probably the least of the promises, it is unaffordable. My state of Illinois in the United States has an unaffordable pension. It has promised enormous amounts of pensions to government workers, and the debt that would ensue if that was converted into explicit claims would be huge. So there is no alternative but to default. Now the question is, do you default on implicit promises like pensions or healthcare, redesign them so that the payout is lower over time? Or do you do an explicit default on your bonds? Now the explicit default could be like Greece, or it could be through inflation. Higher rates of inflation will of course push down the real value of the bond repayments. Now which approach you choose will affect different classes of people and will affect the social equilibrium. Just as a case in point, and I don't want to be over dramatic about it, but the Germans and the Austrians chose hyperinflation in the 20s to get rid of their debt. In the process of choosing that hyperinflation, they wiped out the middle class. By wiping out the middle class, some people argue it set the stage for the arrival of extreme right-wing parties, and we know what happened next. So what process you choose to default on your debt, which debts you default on, affects the social fabric and affects the makeup of society going forward, affects longer-term outcomes. That's a big choice industrial countries have to make over the medium term. I think the other big issue that confronts us over the next few years, we know that emerging markets are going to be the engine of growth. They have to be. The younger, typically, not always, but they're also growing from a lower base, so they have to grow faster. But the key question is, can they manage on their own? In the last 10 years, we see emerging markets have much better financial health than industrial countries. But that's only because the industrial countries sacrificed their own financial health in overspending, in creating the demand for emerging market products which the emerging markets could satisfy. Export-led growth is a very stable form of growth because you're not creating your own demand. You don't have credit booms necessarily in your own country. You can satisfy somebody else's demand and you can grow. But when that's no longer available, when you have to create your own demand, you create credit booms of your own. You create problems for yourself, as we've seen China create for itself through its massive credit expansion in 2008, as we see Brazil creating for itself. Today, The average Brazilian household spends 20% of income on servicing debt. 20% is going to debt service. That's a huge load. So the question is, can the emerging markets, now that they have to look for demand internally, can they avoid the booms and busts? And the first signs from the post-crisis era is no, they can't. Because the slowdown in Brazil, the slowdown in China, the slowdown in India are all because they're overheating, they applied the brakes, now they're slowing down and cooling off. I think this is something we have to watch and can't take for granted. Okay, let me detail these a little more and then take some questions. In the euro area, we had the OMT. I'm going to pass through this quickly because you know about all this. Essentially, Mario Draghi came to the rescue of the system by, I think it's called outright monetary transaction because it's actually a fiscal transaction disguised as a monetary transaction. They want to emphasize it's monetary, but actually it's fiscal. What is the fiscal aspect? The ECB is basically saying we're willing to take losses on government debt of these countries if those losses ever emerge, because we're going to finance them come what may. And we're going to finance them through the traditional route central banks have of printing money. This has a tremendous effect on the markets because it has lowered the temperature in the markets for Italian bonds and for Spanish bonds. The key question, of course, is will these countries adopt the conditionality that is required in order to get these bonds? Thus far, they've avoided it. Thus far, Spain and Italy have not entered any program. The ECB has said, we are willing to lend you, provided you enter a program which assures your ability to regain access to the financial markets or to maintain access to the financial markets. This is the kind of conditionality that the IMF would apply. None of these countries have taken it up as yet because just the signal that the ECB is willing to come in has lowered yields. I don't think we're at the end of the story. I think sometime during this year, perhaps before the Italian elections, Italy is going to experience possibly a widening of Italian yields once again. And at that time, there will be some sense that perhaps Italy has to confirm that it will stay with the reforms that the Monti government has initiated, and perhaps at that point, it may go into an OMT program. Similarly, I think Spain, while it has made some progress, may still need a full-blown program, and we have to see if and when that happens. But the idea behind this is, I think, very clear. It suggests that the ECB is very much against any possibility of euro breakup and is willing to absorb the losses that might ensue by buying the government debt of these countries. So I think this is very good in creating support for government debt. But of course, there's more that has to be done. One thing that has to be done is reassure investors that the banks are safe and the banks themselves can go out and lend. After all, Europe is very highly dependent on bank credit. And this is something which, one of the reasons to do this and one of the reasons to have a euro-wide system is precisely because one of the big fears is that these countries might leave the euro area, might adopt their own currency. If you are an investor, depositor in a Spanish bank, and you fear that Spain may leave the euro and go into pesetas, what do? You take out your money because you know the peseta will be worth much less than the euro. And that is what Spain was experiencing, a serious drain on deposits. Deposits were coming down as people were withdrawing deposits. The announcement of the OMT stopped that drain because people felt, okay, this is enough to support Spain. It's not going to leave the euro area. I'm not going to take out my money even from sound banks, sound Spanish banks, and put them elsewhere. But we're still not completely done. If fears arise once again, you could see a deposit run in these countries. And therefore, it's important to have some kind of a euro-wide support. Spain saying it's going to support its own banks is not particularly credible when Spain's own credit rating is under question. So what we need is more of a euro-wide guarantee, but this implies euro-wide supervision so that banks don't take undue risks. It requires significant institutional change. And of course, the idea behind OMT was to give governments the time to do this. Unfortunately, we haven't made much progress on this yet. And if you look at bank lending levels, the spreads, that's on the right-hand side, for periphery bank lending to companies is still much higher than the spreads for German lending to companies in Germany. Now, if you're running a common monetary policy, you better have spreads on bank lending which are commensurate with each other. Otherwise, the common monetary policy doesn't quite work, because ultimately monetary policy is also about credit. And if credit is so widely priced, if the spreads are so different, it means countries are experiencing very different credit levels, and we're not going to get the kind of recovery we need from the periphery unless those spreads come down substantially and the quantities of lending go up. Now, in addition, of course, it's not just bank lending that is needed. We also need structural reforms, greater competitiveness in the periphery countries. The good news is there is scope for doing this, that many of these countries, Greece, for example, but also Spain, have restrictive labor market practices, have uncompetitive service sectors. More competition, more liberalization in those areas will create the kind of competition and energy that is needed to create more growth. And in fact, there has been a substantial amount of progress made, for example, in Spain, even without the currency depreciating. Labor costs in Spain have come down substantially. I sit on a board with a car manufacturer who has a factory in Spain, and he says now it's his most productive factory in Europe. It used to be one of his least productive, but he says it's become his most productive because they've been able to negotiate with the unions, push down labor costs, and also expand the kinds of things workers are willing to do. So there's been some progress in Spain and Portugal, which reflects in greater exports from these countries, but very little progress in Greece so far. The last thing that needs to happen in Europe is debt forgiveness. These levels of debt are unsustainable. Certainly in Greece, perhaps in Ireland, maybe in Spain. If you have such high levels of debt and you need debt forgiveness, the idea behind debt forgiveness is you write down the debt today. That creates much more incentive to grow. That creates much more growth in the next few years, makes the existing debt after you write it down sustainable. However, if you don't write it down, you get very low growth, and that goes on for a few years and makes the level of debt that's ultimately repaid even lower. So if you are a creditor to these countries and you want to do the right thing by the country but also by yourself, some debt forgiveness when debt levels reach very high levels is probably warranted. Unfortunately, there is very little appetite for debt forgiveness, certainly in Germany and certainly before the elections. I see extreme reluctance to talk about these issues in Germany. They want to see what happens first. They want to give Greece time to actually do some of the things it has promised before going down that route. So we come to the big question, right? Europe is wealthy, wealthier than the United States on a per capita basis. If you look at household net worth, the percent of gross disposable income that household net worth is, in Europe it's about 6.25 times per capita income. In the US, it's about 5 times. Now, of course, the US is a little higher per capita on average than Europe, but in general, Europe is not doing badly. So the question that people in the United States have is, what's the problem? I mean, you have high debt loads, but you have enough wealth to pay it off. And the problem, of course, is the wealth is not necessarily where the debt is, and politics prevents the kinds of forgiveness that sometimes are warranted. Certainly from the German side, the Germans feel that they endured 5, 6, 7 years of great pain when they did their reforms in the early 2000s, the Hartz IV reforms, for example. And they say, we did reunification with East Germany. We paid the price. We paid enormous amounts of transfers to East Germany. And now, after many years of hardship, without wages going up in Germany, we have finally managed to absorb the excess labor force that came to us from East Germany. We took the pain. And now that we've finished taking the pain and we are moderately successful, you come around and tell us, we got to take more pain. And we got to take more pain. Why? Because you won't adjust. That's a hard sell. That's a hard sell to the Germans. And you know, the other countries, the periphery countries are saying, well, that's not quite the story. We also spent, and we spent to buy your stuff. And so you got some of the benefits from our spending. But also, we will reform. We promise to reform, but not just today. We'll do it tomorrow. Of course, promises of reform tomorrow are not credible, right? Because we've been promising. In fact, the Germans say, that's precisely what you promised when you came into the euro area. You said you would be good citizens, not overspend, you'd maintain good budgets, and so on, and see what happened. You fooled us then, don't expect to fool us once again. So there is this tension that doing all the reforms today is very painful. So countries need time to do the reforms. On the other hand, if they don't even start doing the reforms, Germany says, how do we trust you? You haven't done very much, and you've promised a lot, we don't think you'll do it. That's the mismatch which creates the need for the kind of conditionality that is now embedded in the OMT. Ultimately, I think we will have to see these programs by which countries commit to doing these kinds of reforms and in a sense have to sacrifice sovereignty for some form of financing. That is typically what the IMF does. It is something that Europe will do. Bottom line, I think Europe is stabilizing, but we may still see some programs in Italy, in Spain, in Greece. But I don't think we will get a grand resolution, because what is happening is the political room to act becomes greater as the financial markets turn down. What we've seen in Europe is every time there's a financial crisis, the politicians come together in one grand weekend, which is going to solve everything, and they manage to calm down the temperature a little bit with some actions. But they don't do anything after that, because the temperature has calmed down. They have no more political room to act, because they've done everything they could over that weekend. And so again, nothing gets done until the temperature builds up again. The financial markets react, spreads widen. They say the euro is going to collapse. Again, they come together for a weekend. They do a little more. Again, the market temperature cools. So what you're seeing is action is directly proportional to the space the markets create, because otherwise there's very little room for political action. Ultimately, the sense is we will do what is necessary. That is very firm. We will do what is necessary. But we won't do it today. We'll do it as time goes along and we get the political room. That means what we're going to see is a slow, blown-out resolution. It's not going to happen soon. It's going to happen over time. It's going to be punctuated by crises, mini crises, hopefully not maxi crises. But that's the way Europe is going to go. Chancellor Merkel is the one who says this is not a few months project. This is a 5-year project. She set the term 5 years. I have no reason to doubt her. I think eventually we will get debt write-offs in Europe. Eventually we'll get new institutions. But this is not going to happen tomorrow. It's a process of evolution. We go quickly to the United States. The US is growth slowed once again. This is the third year in a row growth has slowed going into summer, picked up towards the end of the year. Typically what's been happening is consumption has been slowing into summer. This time investment slowed into summer, and people argue that some of this was the uncertainty created by the fiscal cliff, but also uncertainty about demand. When you talk to US business people, they say, we've been investing. Last 3 years we've invested a lot. Where's the demand? We don't see the demand, therefore we stopped investing. However, the good news is it was a temporary slowdown. It seems to be picking back up, but there are other reasons to be optimistic about about the United States. First is, one of the big factors for housing demand is the number of households that are created. What happened during the recession is very few households were being created. Children didn't move out of their parents' house. They stayed on the couch in the basement because they didn't really have a job. They couldn't actually pay rent or buy a house. Now they're finding jobs. They're moving out of their parents' houses. New households are forming. And the single biggest determinant of demand for new houses is the number of new households. And what you see is the new households are picking up, but the supply of new housing has remained low. There's a difference between demand and supply, which is going to boost up supply. So I think construction is coming back quite strongly, especially because housing is now much more affordable than it used to be. That's going to give a lot of support to growth. US construction, residential construction, came down from 6% of GDP to 2%. The average is about 4%. It's going to go back. That's going to be a support to growth. Second, consumer confidence is picking up on the backs of at least a moderate labor market. It's not spectacular, but it's moderate. House prices are picking up. That's the single biggest source of wealth for households. This is giving households confidence. I think the US is picking up. Private sector growth, therefore, is relatively strong, but there is the withdrawal of government stimulus, and that is going to be what one calls a drag on growth. We've avoided the fiscal cliff, but we've avoided it by kicking the ball down the road just a little bit. The big cuts to spending that were to take place on January 1st are now postponed to March 1st. The debt ceiling, which is very important because the US has a debt ceiling which Congress has to approve every time, that has been hit. Now the Treasury is finding all sorts of ways to raise money, but it will run out of those ways to raise money in about 2 months. So in 2 months, we're going to face effectively another set of issues for the United States, and this time around the Republicans are really angry. They say, we gave in on December 31st, this time we're going to fight them. And we're going to fight them because this time we have the power, we can essentially hold out against President Obama. Now, that's going to create a messy fight. And the problem is these things don't get resolved before the end, and I'll talk a little bit about why in a second. But all this is forgetting the fact that the single biggest issue for the United States is not the fiscal deficit, but it is the entitlement problem, how much they're going to spend on Social Security, how much they're going to spend on healthcare. If they don't fix that, those are liabilities which, different calculations, but are 6 to 7 times GDP. 6 to 7 times GDP, and by some calculations, many times more. If debt is not the biggest issue in the United States, it's those liabilities, and they need to take an axe to them. That is the debate they're not having right now. But the bottom line for the United States is there's steady, though not spectacular growth. But the United States, like Europe, doesn't seem to be getting ahead of its political problems. And in the United States, the reason is a little different, but it has some similar undertones. In the United States, there's very little bipartisanship, very little crossing over between the Democrats and the Republicans. I would argue there are two big reasons for this. One is, over time, the districts these people come from has been changed. In the US, you have something called gerrymandering. It is a process by which every so many years, in a state, they can redraw the districts, the political districts that representatives are elected from. So what happens is, if you're a Republican, you redraw the district so that you have largely Republicans in that district, and the core Democrats are pushed into one district so that they can all elect one guy, but they don't have an influence on the other districts. Why is it called gerrymandering? Because Governor Gerry, historical governor, created a district which looked like a salamander in this redistricting, so it became known as gerrymandering. But the point about gerrymandering is you create very, very partisan districts. The Republican districts have largely Republicans, and if you're a Democratic government in the state, you create largely Democratic districts, which means the fight for election goes back to the primaries. If you win the Republican primary, you're almost surely going to win the general election because the Democrat has no chance in your district. Similarly, on the Democratic side, if you win the Democratic primary, you're going to win the general election. Which means if you're going to fight the primary, basically, you move more to the right if you're a Republican, more to the left if you're a Democrat. And so we get leftists and rightists in Congress who can't talk to each other. And the leftists support redistribution, the rightists support lower taxes. We saw that they didn't really talk to each other except towards the end when disaster loomed. And in fact, you're not going to get an agreement before the end. You're not going to get an agreement before the deadline, because how can you sell it to your constituents? If, for example, Speaker Boehner had gone on 10th December and said, we've solved the fiscal cliff problem, we've decided on a grand agreement between me and President Obama, what would he have faced from the better result? Because you can do more. And that's the problem. The kind of sort of political division means you can't get agreement till the very end. So I think what we're going to get is, similar to Europe, political problems will mean that we can't get fully ahead of the problem. The fiscal problems will remain with us, but I think these problems are less than in Europe. And plus, there are benefits in the United States, like the energy boom, which is creating low-cost power, and the technology, which is always an advantage of the United States. Massive new technologies in social media, but also with big data. I think these are going to be very important in business in the years to come. So all this put together means the US is still going to be a very attractive place in the years to come. Let me end finally with China. China slowed because the export market slowed, because it was reluctant to do the kind of stimulus it did in 2008 when it told the banks to go out and lend. They lent. There's massive investment in infrastructure, but much of that investment now looks like it may have been premature and may not return what it was thought it would return. Of course, the Chinese slowing has meant other emerging markets have slowed, and also commodity prices have come down somewhat relative to what was anticipated. But I think that if you look at what's been happening in China, they've managed to stabilize the economy, at least as far as recent numbers suggest, and it looks like they're picking up once again, at least to a moderate pace of growth. In China, that means 8%, and that should be pretty good for the rest of the world. Two big shifts happening in China. One, the Chinese population is getting older, but importantly, the labor force is no longer growing. Labor force is plateauing. This means there isn't this huge reserve army of Chinese workers waiting to get into the labor force, keeping down wages. And that's a good thing for China because it increases household wages. And one of the big factors in China, why China has been consuming so little, consumption in China as a fraction of GDP is 35%. In other emerging markets, in India, it's 70%. Why is it twice as big in India relative to China? Because in China, households get only a small fraction of the income generated by the economy. The rest goes to corporations, including the state-owned enterprises. So you need to increase what the households get. One way to do it is increase wages. And the Chinese government has been actively supporting the wage increase because it thinks, as part of its new strategy, it wants to rely more on domestic demand rather than international demand. And the way to get domestic demand is to make the households feel wealthier. So one strategy is to increase household wages. Another strategy over time will be financial sector reform so that there's more retail credit and that households get more returns on the deposits they're putting into the banks. So these are big changes that are happening in China. And these changes are supported by an evening out of Chinese growth. China used to grow on the coastal provinces. Now there's much more growth coming from the interior areas, and that's also meaning that fewer people are migrating to coastal provinces. Wages are increasing tremendously fast in the coastal provinces. Higher wages means the kind of spectacular growth that China had is probably going to slow somewhat from the 12, 13, 14% to 7, 8%. But it also means that China has to move up the value chain. It can't make the cheap stuff it used to make before because it simply doesn't have the cost structure to do that. That cost structure is moving elsewhere. So this is something that's quite interesting when you look at China's exports. It used to be footwear, children's toys, the cheap stuff that you buy. Increasingly, it's computers, cell phones, high-tech electronics. It's moving up the value chain. Now you would say, oh, that's obvious. China just assembles this stuff and sells it. The real stuff is made in Taiwan, Korea, and so on. And that used to be true. If you look at this slide, which shows China's exports, the exports used to be pretty close to imports in business equipment, computer parts, peripherals. That means it imported a lot and just did a little bit of assembly and exported it. But increasingly, as you see, the exports are growing much faster than imports. That is, it's making more of the stuff domestically. It has its own chip factories. It has its own LCD factories and so on. So China is competing now with the Koreas and Japan in high-tech electronics. So this means two things. First, it means that China is leaving certain areas, which spells opportunity for Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, and perhaps even India, as they enter the low-cost manufacturing that China is evacuating. But it also means that there's a threat for Korea, for Japan, perhaps for the Netherlands, because China's entering the high-tech areas. And interestingly, China is entering these high-tech areas much before other countries do. Typically, countries enter the high-tech areas. What we have on the y-axis is your exports of high-tech equipment. On the x-axis, you have your years of schooling. What you see is as you have more years of schooling on average in the country, as you get more educated, typically more wealthier, you export more of the high-tech stuff. That seems natural. You see where the United States is, right on the extreme right. But China is already exporting more than its share of high-tech stuff, even though it has only moderate levels of schooling. You might ask, how is this happening? Where are they getting the technology from? Well, the truth is, well, some they're expropriating, but some they are actually inventing on their own, because China has a very highly educated workforce. It may not be the entire workforce, but at least some part of the workforce is very highly educated in really good universities like Tsinghua University, Beijing University. It has world-class institutes now, and it is producing a world-class output in small doses, and that's enabling it to move up. So there is a huge economic transition underway in China. Now, of course, this economic transition means a political transition. There is no country I can name which has a successful market economy and is not democratic. So there is pressure for democracy. As you need a more creative class, the creative class wants to be more free. The middle class in China is expressing, most recently, anger against censorship. So when the middle class is coming together through social media, it is a force that cannot be resisted. My sense is we have seen the last Chinese transition in which people were told who their leaders would be. Next time around, 10 years from now, I think the people will have a much bigger say in who their leaders are. The big question is, how does this political transition take place? It's not an easy transition. The other big issue for China is its relationships with neighbors. The country with the most neighbors is Russia. China is the country with the second most neighbors. It has 14 neighbors. And unfortunately, it has fought a war in the last 70 years with 5 of them. Question is, can China manage its relationships with its neighbors effectively? These have big economic effects. The China-Japan fight over the last quarter of last year subtracted 0.25 percentage points of Japan GDP. That's a big number. And I think it could get bigger if these fights get more dramatic. We need to cool down the temperature in Asia. It's a big source of growth. Too many age-old antagonisms. Age-old antagonisms fed by the fact that the educational system tells you you're a victim. In China, you have been a victim for the last 50 years, a victim of Japan, a victim of the West, and therefore anything you do is to some extent justified by the victimhood. And similarly in Japan, I mean, no country is free of blame. Everybody has their own version of history, which is nationalistic, and that is problematic in Asia. Let me end with 2 issues. I said we have to worry about what promises we'll give. Will inflation be the way that we solve our problem of debt? And I think right now, nobody really knows. The real sector is very subdued. There are very few inflationary pressures from the real sector. But if you look at the amount of monetary assets that have been created, they are enormous. And so a worry is, does anybody really know how we exit? And will the exit be smooth? Supposing the exit starts getting complicated, supposing interest rates start picking up, long-term interest rates in the US, the Fed starts losing a lot of money on its bond holdings, there's pressure from Congress to sell those bond holdings, and interest rates start jacking up even more, China gets fright at the loss of value of its US bonds, starts selling the US bonds. That's a complicated situation. We haven't thought through it completely. We don't know what could happen. It is a worry, and as central banks get more politicized, I think the worry is they will not be able to manage this in a way that is stable. The second big question, I think, is can the emerging markets be different this time? Can they avoid the booms and busts that typically they've had when they've created their own demand? And some people say yes, because we have better macro fundamentals in the emerging markets. And of course, capital is going to migrate to the emerging markets because there are no good alternatives in industrial countries. But we've heard this story before. We've heard it many times. This time is different for the emerging markets. Typically, it hasn't proven different. And so the skeptics say, no, the macro fundamentals are better only because industrial countries overspent, and now they're not willing to overspend anymore. And because fundamentals are deteriorating in emerging markets, we're going to see the asset price booms and busts once again. That would suggest be cautious. I mean, emerging markets are indeed the future, but they're not an unmitigated, riskless future. There are potential problems down the line with them. So, bottom line, I think you'll get much more investment advice over the day, but the world, in my view, continues to be in a slow recovery. We are confronting. The good news is we are being forced to address problems that we were postponing. The crisis has brought these problems forward. Demographic change had to be confronted in Europe. Promises were too much. We have to confront them. The global rebalancing, moving demand to the emerging markets away from the rich countries, also was needed, if nothing else for the sustainability of the environment. The emerging markets need to consume more. Rich countries need to consume somewhat less. These remedies will take time, and the remedies will almost inevitably result in political conflict, which then will create massive pressure for short-term fixes and also increasing social and international challenges. Doesn't sound happy, but I'm an optimist. I think, in general, humankind is tremendously ingenious. Whenever we have problems which look like they can't be fixed, we fix them, just like the euro area does. And so I think going forward, both the political will as well as human ingenuity will emerge to make sure that these problems that confront us today are in fact fixed. In the short run, I think next year will be better than last year. This year will be better than last year, so at least that's something to look forward to. So with that, let me say thank you.
Thank you, and then we open up for questions from Mr. Rajan. Over there, you get the microphone.
Very interesting speech, but you said we need growth. But when everybody is saying that Greece need to cut spendings, the Italians, the Spanish need to cut, how do you get growth by cutting spendings? If you think about John Maynard Keynes, Roosevelt in the Depression used some of the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. Hitler, he didn't know about Mr. Keynes, I think, but he turned the German economy from trouble into employment for the people. How do you increase growth by cutting spendings?
Well, first, I think in the short run, you're absolutely right that you cannot increase growth by cutting spending. But I think the operative word is sustainable growth. That if your growth comes from creating government jobs or creating bridges to nowhere, which is the Japanese way of growth, it's not clear that in the long run this benefits society. It is unsustainable. The Keynesian approach is, let me create government spending for a short time so that it revives the private sector spirits and the private sector steps in. That works when you have a cyclical downturn. But when you have a structural problem, that is, the old sources of growth don't work, because demand has collapsed because there's no spending power. You need to create new sustainable source of growth. Government stepping in is not credible because the government has to stay in for a long, long time. Of course, we could follow the Hitlerian approach and rearm for some World War III or World War IV. But again, at some point, we need unlimited government finances. It helps if you've just sort of completely destroyed your debt through hyperinflation and you don't have very much debt. But if you have the kind of debt loads that you have, you still have a hyperinflation to go through before you get to the Hitlerian position. So the point I'm trying to make is absolutely right that austerity is going to subtract from growth. And perhaps some austerity is too much. I mean, there are some government jobs which are very important. You don't want to let go of those because they will subtract seriously from growth. You have to be sensible about where you cut. But at the same time, it is not government spending which is going to get out of the crisis. It is the private sector knowing, or government-owned enterprises knowing that there is a future that they can invest in, and then creating the jobs. You need to create that confidence. You don't necessarily create that confidence in the current environment by creating even more doubt about government finance. So that's the dilemma these countries are in.
That's the way of booming.
Yeah, in the short run, again, I mean, the war, I think, is an interesting possibility. But of course, we know the longer run consequences of war are not welfare improving. So I would hesitate going down that path.
More questions?
Yes, thank you. Hello? Yeah. Thank you for a nice speech. About the fiscal wall, we have here in Norway and many other European countries raised our sales tax to 25%. And last time I was in the States, it was federal sales tax, I think, 7%. Would increasing the sales tax in the States affect the fiscal wall?
Yeah. First, I don't think there is a federal sales tax, at least on retail. It's largely, if it is, it's a small one, largely a state sales tax. And the reluctance in the United States, this is an issue. You're absolutely right. This is something that a number of economists have pointed out as a possible answer to the fiscal issues in the United States that would also, tax consumption rather than taxing income, which might be a better way to go in their view. The problem, I think, the reluctance of conservatives to embrace the sales tax or VAT is simply that they feel then it would be too easy for the government to raise revenues, which is what the states have done, gently increase the sales tax every few years. Nobody really protests very much when it's 25 basis points because it's so widely spread. And so they feel this is the slippery edge of the slippery slope, and there will be too much in terms of sales tax increases over time, so they don't want to go there.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rajan.
Thank you.
Da tar vi kaffepause og er tilbake 11:15.